everybody. Welcome to Introduction to Cryptography. Today we're going to be talking about digital signatures. All of the learning objectives for this class are available at this link. So you can get an overview of the whole class, and this is partway through the semester. So let's talk about what we're going to do today and what we've seen prior that I'm building on. Today's learning objective is C6b. Define fundamental public key cryptographic algorithms such as digital signatures. Previous learning objectives in this class have been C1. Define and differentiate between secret key and public key cryptosystems. C7a. Define fundamental secret key cryptographic algorithms such as message authentication codes. C6a. Define fundamental public key cryptographic algorithms such as encryption. So one thing that's emphasized here is the ability to differentiate between secret key and public key cryptosystems. So one thing to take away from today is digital signatures are the public key analog to message authentication codes, which are for secret key. We have already talked about public key cryptographic algorithms, but so far we've only talked about encryption. So I also want us to be able to understand the difference between encryption and digital signatures, because they're going to accomplish different things. Good. So a little motivation for why digital signatures in the first place. I had this thought of being able to submit petitions, which you might do if you were part of some sort of parliament or Congress or student government. So you want to submit some sort of petition and you want to make sure that it comes from you. Now, we still have old school ways of doing this where people literally have, sheets of paper that they do this with, but we live in a world now. It should also be possible to submit petitions digitally. This is a smart card reader, so perhaps, with your government ID, you can put your card in the reader and then you can write your petition and send it out. And the question becomes then, how are we going to verify who this petition comes from? Right? So let's pause here a moment and let's just consider the situation of wanting to submit petitions digitally. What are the requirements that you might have for this sort of petition? What do you want to ensure? What are your security guarantees? So one guarantee that you might want to have is this concept of data authentication, which is to say the message actually came from the sender that it says it's from. For example, that a petition came from Bob. So let's say Bob is signing this petition and he says, let's raise wages. Now, this courier here is going to send this message to Alice, and she's going to receive the message. And now we want to ensure that Alice here gets the message that Bob actually authenticated. We talked about data authentication. We also have a concept of data integrity, meaning that the data cannot be changed, for example, in transit. So Bob signed this petition. He sends it to Alice via this courier, and Alice is convinced that the message really came from him and it hasn't been changed, even though she thinks that this courier looks super sus. Now, we have talked about data authentication and integrity before in the context of message authentication codes. We have also talked about a concept of data confidentiality in the context of encryption. So going back to that, these requirements still remain the same even in public key settings, but let's take a moment to think. How does data authentication or integrity differ from data confidentiality? So confidentiality gives you this concept of privacy, meaning only the intended recipient can see the communication. So let's say Bob encrypts a message and sends it to Alice. Now, something can happen here with just ensuring confidentiality, which is Bob's going to send his ciphertext. The courier, who is named Oscar, by the way, is going to take it, and he's going to modify it and send it to Alice. Now, Oscar can't see what's in that ciphertext, but he can change the ciphertext. Alice can still decrypt it, and it might decrypt to something weird or something that doesn't make any sense, but the point is that she doesn't get the message that Bob sent her in the first place. In contrast, data authentication or integrity doesn't ensure the message is private, but it does mean that the message was sent by that actual alleged signer and it was not tampered with. We have previously talked about message authentication codes, which is a private key data authentication scheme. So what is the difference between private key and public key schemes? So for private key, it means that Alice and Bob actually have a shared key that they keep between each other. They might have met up ahead of time and used that meeting to set up a key between the two of them, which we'll call a secure channel. Now, later on, if Bob wants to send a message specifically to Alice, he can use that key K to create a tag that he sends along with that message. Alice, who also has the key K, can verify, and she is the only one that can do that. So a message authentication code works when you have two people like this because only one other person needs to verify that those messages came from you. But lots of people want to talk to lots of other people. We don't just have Alice and Bob, we can have many more people. Let's assume that there's 4. So let's say Alice, Bob, Callie, and David. If I have 4 people and I want to have pairwise keys between each of them, how many keys would you need? So it's going to end up being 4 choose 2, which is 6. So with more and more people who want to be able to verify each other's messages, message authentication codes become a bit unwieldy to use. And that's not the only issue. If everyone had pairwise keys, how could you publicly verify messages? Since Alice and Bob share a key, Alice can verify any messages from Bob, and Bob can verify any messages from Alice. But Callie and David, who don't have that key, won't be able to do anything with that information. They can see a tag and they can see a message, but they can't do anything with it. So, for the context of wanting this kind of public verification, we're going to have to go with digital. Luckily for us, digital signatures are public key. We've talked already about public key in the context of encryption, and we talked about how there would be a public key and a private key. So with digital signatures, it's the same. Bob has to generate his own private public key pair, and he's going to publish the public key. So everyone can use that public key to verify that signatures come from him, but he's the only one that can create signatures on his own using his private key. The algorithm looks like this. And this is the first time we're actually seeing a little bit of formalism on here. SK-VK, which comes from keygen of n. And so keygen is the algorithm here. So SK here is that private key, or also known as secret key, and VK is the public key, also known as verification key. The verification key or public key is what gets published. Perhaps Bob nails it onto a bulletin board for everyone to see. In case you're wondering, that number n is needed to decide how much security that the cryptographic algorithm can have. The specific value of n can depend on the specific cryptographic hardness assumption being used. So it could represent 128 bits or like 4096 bits, things like that. For us, this is not super important, but it's just in case you are curious about what that n means. Okay, great. So now that Bob has a secret key, he can go ahead and sign a message, which I call MSG. The algorithm looks like this. Sigma gets sign with SK on MSG. So SK, remember, is Bob's secret key. MSG is the message he wants to sign. And it's going to create this signature called Sigma. Once Bob signs the message, he can send it out into the world along with Sigma. This should look very familiar because it looks a lot like what we did with message authentication codes. Bob sent out a message, MSG, and he also sends out something else for the message authentication code. It's not called a signature in that case. What do we call it if we are sending out a message authentication code? Try to remember back to the previous slide. Okay, so it's called a tag. Another way to refer to it is also called a message digest. And in fact, you can just call it a MAC. Good. So last part, Alice is going to get that message and she's going to accept it if the signature verifies. So she's going to use the verification key, VK, along with the message and Sigma, and she's either going to get a 1 or 0. And she just checks it. If it's a 1, it verifies, and she's going to believe it really came from Bob, and if it's 0, the signature did not verify. So just putting it together, we have signing and verifying, where one of the people will sign, send out that message and that signature, and the other party will verify it with the verification key. So digital signature is defined as being a tuple of 3 algorithms: keygen, sign, and verify. So this is probably, if you're taking notes, what you want to write down. SKVK comes from keygen on N. Sigma comes from sign of SK on MSG, the message. And 1 or 0 is from the verification, VK, of MSG and Sigma. Good. So now that we know this, we have the syntax of a digital signature. Let's look into the security. So we did solve one of our problems with message authentication codes. Here, with digital signatures, anyone can read the messages Bob signs and confirm it's from him. We've been talking about Alice. Of course, she can verify, but so can this Cocker Spaniel, I suppose, and also Callie. So anyone can see these messages and confirm that the signature really does come from Bob. But remember, that includes the super sus courier, Oscar. So let's suppose that Oscar is there trying to get in the middle. What might Oscar try to do with the messages and the signatures? So he just wants to mess things up. What might he try to do? Okay, he could try to modify the message or signature, right? He shouldn't be able to do this, right? That's why we have authentication and integrity, but this is something that Oscar is going to try to do. Maybe he's going to see a lot of messages that Bob sends out, and he could try to maybe modify the signatures with that in mind. Let's look at an example of how he might do this. Bob, of course, says, let's raise wages, and he also sends out a message that says, let's lower fees. So he'll send these messages out, maybe he puts them on a bulletin board, but Oscar is going to come in the night, and he's going to see both of those signatures, and he might try to do a little mix and match and create a message that says, let's raise fees, that Alice is going to think looks like it comes from Bob. So now, of course, we do have to wonder, what properties do we need in a digital signature to keep Oscar from changing either the message or signature? Because hopefully, Dave here does not think that Bob sent out a message saying, let's raise fees. We talked about this in the context of message authentication codes. What was the name of that security property we guaranteed? And the word really does make sense in the context of signatures. You should not be able to forge a signature. So there is a context, there is a concept of unforgeability in the public key setting, which means that nobody should be able to compute a signature on behalf of a certain verification key, VK, unless said person actually knows the secret key. I've been making this this reference to message authentication codes, so let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's really go back in time and remember when we talked about message authentication codes, we had a game-based definition for the security. So let's take a minute and let's try to remember, what does the message authentication code attack game for unforgeability look like? And let's see if you can try to remember what that picture looks like. So just take maybe 2 minutes and let's figure out what that picture looks like. Okay, so in the attack game for Macs, the very first thing that's going to happen is the Mac challenger is going to generate a key. And I did grab this from the textbook, so the notation is a little bit different, but this is the shared secret key that you would have in a Mac. And now, the adversary, who is perhaps Oscar, will send out a message and receive back a tag. And this arrow here indicates that he can do this over and over again. And so here, this is the generation of the tag that the challenger is going to do benignly and correctly. At the end of all that, the adversary should not be able to forge a MAC, which would be to create a new message and tag. If he can do that, then he has the ability to forge tags. So take a look at this, and the next question for you is, if you can draw this picture, and we've talked about the algorithms for digital signatures, how does this game get modified from, how does a game for digital signatures look as compared to the game for Macs? So let's take another minute. How does the digital signatures attack game for unforgeability differ from the one for Macs? Great. So let's take a look at the attack game for digital signatures. We have this challenger again. And again, because I got this from the textbook, the notation is slightly different, but the challenger is going to get a verification key and secret key from the key generation algorithm. So the way we've seen this before has been SKVK coming from keygen of n. And this is, in terms of the idea, this is going to be equivalent, but it just turns out that the textbook has slightly different notation. And the very first thing that's going to happen here after that is that this key is going to be sent to the adversary. So he actually knows PK. And then, as before, the adversary can ask for many messages and get back a signature on that message. At the end, he's going to have to create a new message and signature that verifies. And if he can do this, then he can forge signatures, and that signature scheme would not be secure. the main difference here that from what we've seen with Max is the adversary does have access to that public key or that verification key. I want to go back to the beginning where I had motivated the idea of digital signatures with this concept of being able to write petitions. So we said perhaps we have a congressional petition, and here are my Congress people, Alice, Bob, Callie, and David, and instead of submitting these petitions on paper, they're actually going to use a smart card reader, put in their smart card, and they'll type a digital message that they'll send out. And anyone can verify that it really did come from these authorized people without that message being changed. Right? So in the context of being able to write petitions in government, data authentication and integrity is very important. However, I'm sure that in the context of government, there are way more other issues that are important. A couple that I can think of off the top of my head are, what about voting? What about whistleblowing? So even though digital signatures make sense in the context of petitioning, they may not be enough for these other sorts of situations. So one thing that I'd like to do once we're done on this part is think about other uses for digital signatures where digital signatures are not enough. And maybe think about why in voting and in whistleblowing, digital signatures would not be enough. So we'll get back to that in a moment. For now, I want to talk about today's learning objectives. We did C6B, define fundamental public key cryptographic algorithms such as digital signatures. So as of today, you are familiar with the definition of that three-tuple of digital signatures, and you have an idea of what the definition of unforgeability for digital signatures is. Next time, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a specific digital signature. So C9, which is Lamport one-time signatures. C10, we're going to review one-way functions. And we've seen one-way functions before. They are used for Lamport's one-time signatures, so we'll have to review them. And G1, which is hash functions. So these are the things that we're going to do next time to understand a specific digital signature scheme. Just to give you a little preview, let's just remind ourselves what one-way functions look like. A one-way function has a property that it's defined from some domain to some range, and calculating f of x is easy. However, calculating f inverse of x is hard. Right? So just if we remember that, that will be the security property that we use for Lamport's signatures. The difference between signature schemes, as we've talked about today, and what we'll talk about next time is Lamport signatures are only one time, which means that the attacker or adversary can only make one query on a single message, and then with only one signature has to output a forged signature for another message. Because one-time secure signature schemes are set up in such a way that if an attacker sees two different signatures, then the scheme is easy to break. And we'll round it all out with this theorem. Lamport's signature scheme is a secure one-time signature scheme, assuming H, which is used in Lamport's signature, is a one-way function. And that's the proof that we will go over in the next class. The reading for next time will be Bonet and Shoup, section 14.1. And now, please let me know if you have any questions about the material.